It happened on a Sunday night. No tanks on the streets, no emergency sirens, no headlines screaming catastrophe. While most of the world was distracted by weekend silence, something far more dangerous than war unfolded behind closed doors. A decision was made that would quietly sever the spine of the global financial system. And almost no one watching television that evening understood what had just been taken from them. For decades, money had weight. It had gravity. Behind every promise printed on paper stood gold. Cold, heavy, unforgiving. Gold did not lie. It did not vote. It did not care who ruled. It simply existed, anchoring human ambition to something real. And because of that, power had limits. But limits are inconvenient for empires. By 1971, the world was drowning in American dollars, yet the gold meant to support them was vanishing. The illusion still held. Barely. People believed their money meant something. Because they mo decides or hosides or azir aitin to told, it did. Because the system demanded faith, and faith when stretched too far begins to crack. That night a single announcement would redraw the invisible map of power, not with violence, but with words. Calm, reassuring, almost boring. A technical adjustment, they said. Temporary, they promised. But history has a habit of disguising revolutions as footnotes. From that moment on, money would no longer be restrained by metal, by nature, or by honesty. It would float freely, backed by confidence, fear, and force. The world would not collapse immediately. That is what makes this story truly dangerous, because the most destructive changes rarely arrive like explosions. They arrive like whispers. To understand what was broken, you first have to understand what once existed. After the ashes of the Second World War settled, the world did not simply rebuild cities. It rebuilt trust. Nations exhausted by chaos gathered with one shared fear. If money itself became a weapon again, the next war would come faster. And it would be worse. So they designed a system meant to restrain ambition. At its center stood gold, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a moral boundary. Paper, money could exist, yes, but only as a shadow of something tangible. Every dollar was a claim. Every claim had a limit. And those limits were supposed to keep governments honest. The United States emerged as the guardian of this order. Its currency became the world's reference point. Not because it was perfect, but because America promised discipline. Dollars could be exchanged for gold, not someday, not hypothetically, on demand. That single promise turned the dollar into a global lifeline and Washington into the vault of the world. For a while, it worked. Trade stabilized. Currencies stopped collapsing overnight. Governments slept easier, knowing there was an anchor beneath the system. Gold sat quietly in underground vaults, unseen but essential, like a load-bearing wall no one noticed, until it started to crack. Yet beneath the surface, a contradiction was growing. The world needed more dollars to grow, but gold did not multiply with ambition. The more America spent, the more the system strained. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rules that were meant to bind power began to feel like chains. What was designed as stability was becoming a constraint. And constraints to an empire in motion are intolerable. By the 1960s, the machine was overheating. America was no longer just the anchor of the system. It was its engine, its banker, and its spender of last resort. Wars were being fought thousands of miles away. Social programs expanded at home. Prosperity was promised without sacrifice. And behind it all, dollars flowed outward faster than gold could ever flow back in. This was the original sin of the new era. The belief that power could be financed indefinitely. The printing presses never slept, but the vaults remained stubbornly finite. Every new dollar was a quiet gamble that no one would come asking for what it was supposedly worth. At first, they didn't. Faith is a powerful anesthetic. As long as confidence held, the system survived. But confidence, once questioned, turns lethal. Foreign governments began to notice the imbalance. Balance sheets told a story speeches could not. There were too many dollars, and not enough gold. What had been an abstract concern became a practical one. If everyone demanded conversion at once, the vaults would empty. The promise would be exposed as impossible. And so the whispers began. Central banks exchanged glances instead of words. Diplomacy grew tense. Then came the moment of quiet defiance. Some nations stopped trusting reassurance and started demanding payment in metal. Gold left the United States not in panic, but with purpose. Each shipment was a vote of no confidence, cast in silence. Each bar that crossed the Atlantic weakened the illusion further. This was not rebellion. It was arithmetic. Inside Washington, the danger was obvious. The system was bleeding, and pretending otherwise only made the wound worse. The world was discovering that the emperor's treasury, like his clothes, was not infinite. The question was no longer whether the promise could be kept. It was whether the truth could be survived. The breaking point did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with paperwork, invoices, conversion requests, polite diplomatic notes that carried an unmistakable message beneath their formal language. We want the gold. What had once been theoretical suddenly became mechanical. Numbers on ledgers were turned into demands on vaults, and the vaults began to echo. One nation in particular made the danger impossible to ignore. Instead of trusting promises, it trusted scales and weight. Dollars were no longer treated as symbols of alliance, but as claims to be settled. Ships crossed the ocean carrying paper in one direction and metal in the other. Each voyage stripped away another layer of American credibility. This was not an attack. It was compliance. The rules allowed it. That was the problem. Every bar of gold leaving the country sent a signal to the rest of the world. The exit was real, and it was still open, for now. If too many followed, the system would collapse under the weight of its own honesty. Inside the corridors of power, fear replaced optimism. Not the fear of enemies, but the fear of exposure. If the gold ran out, the illusion would die in daylight. Markets would panic. Allies would revolt. And America's carefully constructed image as the steward of stability would evaporate overnight. There were only two paths left. One preserved the rules and accepted humiliation. The other destroyed the rules and preserved power. History rarely hesitates at moments like this. And so the conversation shifted. Not how to save the system, but how to escape it. The room grew smaller as the options disappeared. Inside the White House, reality pressed in from every side. Markets were restless. Allies were impatient. The numbers refused to lie, no matter how carefully they were presented. This was no longer an economic debate. It was a countdown. Advisors argued in low voices, aware that history was listening. Some spoke of credibility, of the cost of betrayal, of what it would mean to abandon a promise the world had built itself upon. Others spoke the language of survival. They warned the tours that obedience to the old rules would end in surrender, that gold was no longer a safeguard, but a weapon being turned against its keeper. The dilemma was brutal in its simplicity. Obey the system and watch American power drain away bar by bar. Break the system and force the world to adapt. There was no heroic option, only damage control. Behind the rhetoric of stability lay a harsher truth. The empire had outgrown its restraints. Gold demanded discipline. Discipline demanded limits. And limits were incompatible with a nation financing wars, welfare, and global leadership all at once. So the discussion turned colder. Technical language replaced moral concern. Words like temporary and adjustment were chosen carefully, crafted to soften a decision that could not be justified outright. The public would not be told what was being sacrificed, only what was being protected. Time was running out. The vaults could not wait for consensus. If the announcement came too late, the choice would be made by the markets instead. And markets are far less forgiving than men. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon appeared on television, speaking directly into the living rooms of America. His voice was calm, reassuring, almost paternal. There was no sense of emergency, no admission of crisis, only the tone of a leader making a sensible technical correction. He called it a temporary measure. With carefully chosen words, Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. The gold window, as it was politely named, was closed. Not abolished, not destroyed. Just shut. As if this were a door that could be reopened at will, rather than the foundation of the global monetary system. To the average viewer, it sounded harmless. Sensible, even. A way to protect the dollar. A way to defend American workers. But beneath the smooth delivery lay an irreversible act. In a single sentence, the promise that had anchored world finance for a generation was nullified. No votes were cast. No allies were consulted. No negotiations were held. The decision was unilateral, instantaneous, and final. The world's reserve currency had just been severed from reality itself. In that moment, money changed its nature. It was no longer a claim on something solid. It became a belief system, sustained by confidence, enforced by power, and vulnerable to fear. The anchor was gone. The ship was adrift. The world did not erupt in panic that night. That would come later. What happened instead was more unsettling. Silence. Markets paused. Governments hesitated. Everyone waited for someone else to move first. But there was nothing to reverse. The door had been closed from the inside. And history had just crossed a point of no return. When the markets reopened, the world discovered a brutal truth. There was nowhere to run. Governments protested quietly. Central bankers held emergency meetings behind locked doors. Economists argued on television, insisting this was a pause, a transition, a manageable shock. But beneath the language of control, panic simmered. The rules had changed, and no replacement had been agreed upon. Currencies began to float, not by design, but by necessity. Exchange rates swung wildly, untethered from anything solid. Prices became unstable. Inflation crept in, then surged, eroding savings with a cruelty that felt almost personal. What people had worked for no longer held the same meaning from one year to the next. Yet the system did not collapse. That was the surprise, and perhaps the greatest trap. Without an alternative, the world adapted. The dollar remained dominant not because it was honest, but because it was unavoidable. Trade still needed a medium. Debt still needed a unit of account. And so nations swallowed their resentment and continued to play a game whose referee had just rewritten the rules. Money had become abstract in a way it had never been before. Value was no longer discovered. It was declared. Central banks replaced vaults, trust replaced metal, and trust, unlike gold, could be expanded, manipulated, and weaponized. The shock faded, but the damage settled in slowly, like poison in the bloodstream. The consequences would not be measured in days or months, but in decades. The world had survived the break. What it did not yet understand was the price of survival. The 1970s arrived like a reckoning. Inflation surged across the industrial world, devouring purchasing power and exposing how fragile the new order truly was. Prices spiraled. Wages lagged behind. Savings accounts, once symbols of prudence, became instruments of quiet loss. For ordinary people, it felt like betrayal without a culprit. But while the public struggled, something else was happening beneath the surface. The United States was adapting, faster and more ruthlessly than anyone else. Freed from gold, it could issue debt without constraint. expand credit without apology, and respond to crises with sheer monetary force. What looked like chaos was, in fact, consolidation. Other nations had no such flexibility. Their currencies were weaker, their markets smaller. They were forced to defend exchange rates, drain reserves, and submit to volatility they could not control. The dollar, unchained, began to dominate, not through stability, but through scale. Wall Street learned the new rules quickly. Financial markets exploded in complexity. Derivatives, leverage, and speculative capital replaced factories as engines of growth. Money no longer followed production. Production followed money. This was the quiet transformation. Power shifted from those who made things to those who moved numbers. And at the center of that web stood the dollar, volatile, imperfect, but indispensable. The old system had promised restraint. The new one rewarded excess. And excess, once normalized, becomes doctrine. This was the birth of a new kind of empire. One that did not need colonies, flags, or occupying armies. Its reach extended through balance sheets, interest rates, and debt obligations. Control was no longer exercised with soldiers, but with liquidity. Countries did not have to be conquered. They only had to borrow. Loans arrived wrapped in promises of growth and modernization. Dollars flowed outward, recycling back through global markets, binding economies together in ways that felt cooperative, but were anything but equal. Those who issued the currency dictated the terms. Those who needed it learned obedience. When crises hit, the pattern repeated. Capital fled to safety, and safety meant dollars. Each panic reinforced the same hierarchy. When fear rises, power concentrates. The very instability of the system strengthened its center. This was soft domination at its most elegant. No declarations, no ultimatums. Just incentives structured so that resistance became irrational. Even resentment had to be financed in the same currency that caused it. Gold had once imposed limits on ambition. Fiat money erased them. And in doing so, it turned finance into your geopolitics by other means. Decisions made in distant central banks now shaped elections, social unrest, and the fate of entire nations. The system did not demand loyalty. It demanded dependence, and dependence, once established, is harder to break than any chain. The catastrophe did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded slowly, quietly, disguised as normality. Decades passed, and the world grew accustomed to money without limits. Crises were met with printing. Recessions were answered with debt. Each emergency justified another expansion, another promise that this time would be different. But history keeps receipts. Asset bubbles swelled and burst. Inequality widened. Entire generations discovered that working harder no longer guaranteed stability. Money moved faster than labor, faster than law, faster than accountability. And always, beneath the complexity, the same fragile foundation remained: belief. The system born in 1971 survives not because it is stable, but because it's familiar. Because tearing it down would mean confronting what was lost that night. A boundary, a restraint, a shared understanding that power should answer to something real. Instead, the world chose convenience over truth, flexibility over honesty. And now the questions return. Whispers about gold, about alternatives, about digital money and programmable trust. The language changes, but the fear does not. If money is only faith, what happens when faith runs out? This is the lesson Nixon left behind, whether intended or not. When the anchor is cut, the ship can sail farther than ever before, but it can also drift endlessly, vulnerable to every storm. History is not warning us loudly. It is warning us softly, and that is what makes it dangerous.